The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. Phil DeLuna's research on CO2 conversion and accelerated materials discovery has been published in high-impact journals such as Science and Nature and has been cited more than 9,000 times over the past 5 years. He is a Governor General Gold Medalist, a Forbes Top 30 Under 30, a 2-times TEDx speaker, a member of the Royal Society of Canada, an adjunct professor at the Department of Materials Science and Engineering at the University of Toronto, an Action Canada Fellow, and a former federal MP candidate. He has appeared in several documentaries, co-hosts a podcast called What's Next In, and given hundreds of talks on sustainability, innovation, early career development, and diversity in positions of power. Now let's get into the episode with Phil. Welcome back, Dave, John, and Phil.
Thanks, Lysandra.
It's good to be back.
Pleasure to be here. Excited for the next conversation.
I'm sure our listeners can kind of tell this is probably our third time recording that introduction. So today we're talking about a sustainable future, a very optimistic approach. I'm really excited about today's episode. So Phil, we wanted to start off by asking you, what do you see a sustainable future looking like?
Oh, that's a big question, right? It all depends on what you mean by sustainable and how. There's sustainable in the energy context. There's sustainable in terms of a socioeconomic context, and I think they're intricately linked. So when I talk about sustainability, ultimately my definition is it's a future, it's a world, it's a society where everyone wants for naught, and the world is able to continue without detrimental impacts to each other or to the environment. And that is very ambitious, and that is literally utopia. So I don't know if we're going to get there, but we can make steps and we can make strides. And the number one thing I think existential to that is sustainability from the energy context and from a carbon emissions reduction context. But as I said, I think they're very, very intricately linked. So I'll talk about this in the Canadian context and sustainability. Canada, as a country, I've always viewed as a primary and a tertiary industry economy. We have a lot of natural resource extraction. We have a lot of oil and gas and mining. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have a lot of banking and real estate. We don't really necessarily have as much in the middle anymore of the manufacturing of that value add good. And we were talking before in the previous podcast about, the sort of curse of the plenty. How Canada has had access to an abundance of natural resources and abundance of energy. And if we take into a contrast with some of our G7 colleagues and friends like Japan or Germany, one a landlocked island nation, the other without much natural resources of their own, both of which had to rebuild completely after a devastating world war, both of which had to innovate in order to remain competitive on the world stage. Japan became a leader in electronics and robotics and semiconductor manufacturing and high technology. Germany, a leader in fine chemicals refining and engineering, in hard goods, value-added goods. And in a way, both of which have become more sustainable because of that. Germany is having a huge push in trying to become sustainable from an energy emission standpoint. And Japan, also the same thing, trying to shift their economies to hydrogen. Canada, again, all has the curse of the plenty. We actually have a relatively clean electricity grid. About 82% of our electricity comes from non-carbon emitting sources of fuel, whether that's renewables like hydrogen or wind, hydro, solar, nuclear, etc. Most of it comes from sources which do not emit CO2. The issue is from decarbonizing our electricity grid, getting that last little bit the 18% or so, or that's remaining in our electricity grid to become renewable or non-emission fossil fuel. And then the second is decarbonizing our heavy industry, our transportation, and our buildings and our lived environment. So to me, a sustainable future is a future where we've been able to transform our economy and our society such that the emissions in all of those different sectors have been reduced or completely eliminated. And I always like to give people a kind of a 5-step plan to get to net zero. Step 1 is protect what we have. And that's, environmental protections, making sure that we're not cutting down old growth forests, which are huge carbon sinks for lumber, or protecting the Amazon rainforest instead of clearing it for cattle. So that's step 1. Step two is renewables everywhere. We have to scale up and scale out as much of the renewable capacity that we have, and which is a good thing because renewables are cheaper today than many fossil fuels in many jurisdictions of the world. That cost is continuing to decrease as things scale, so we have to work on that. Step three is to electrify everything, and that's everything from electrifying as much as possible our homes through electric heat pumps and these sorts of things, to electrifying our industry like electric furnaces to make steel and all these sorts of, and kilns, etc., to electrifying our transportation through electric vehicles. Step four is to tackle hard to abate sectors, sectors where CO2 emissions are a nature of the process in which this sector produces. That's the cement, that's the steel, that's the fertilizer. We have to fundamentally change the way that we make these products in order to reduce the emissions involved in them. But at step five, even if we do all of that, even if we go to zero emissions tomorrow, we still have too much CO2 in the atmosphere. So we have to capture that CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it underground, remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So those five steps: protect what we have, renewables everywhere, electrify everything, tackle hard to abate sectors, and capture carbon from the atmosphere. If we can do that, if that is what a sustainable future looks like to me, and the beauty of it is that we need all hands on deck in order for this to happen. And especially the folks who have the skills in the oil and gas trade right now. Whether we're building carbon capture plants or hydrogen plants or geothermal plants, we still need welders and technicians and chemical engineers with deep expertise in fluid mechanics and heat transfer. So we have this entire skilled workforce that right now is being used to extract energy from fossil fuels that could very easily, with very limited upskilling, be used to transition that economy into a low carbon one. And so a sustainable future is one where we've walked through those five steps, we've accomplished those five steps, and we've done it in a way that creates prosperity and job growth for everyone, even those who are in the heavy emission sectors today.
All right, Phil, we'll have that done by tomorrow, right?
Yeah, well, we're trying.
Yeah, on that, I suppose one take on it is, sustainability is a big umbrella, and that, transition to a low carbon economy is part of that sustainability. We keep coming back to this thing. We talked in the previous thing about what's a clean fuel. We get the thing here, what is sustainable? And I was thinking that, yes, if you can explain to somebody what sustainable future is and then say to them, are you in favour of a sustainable future? I'm guessing we'll get a pretty high score of people saying that we should do it. But it then comes down to who is responsible for delivering that sustainable future? So that's the question I would like to ask you. Who's responsible? Who can make the biggest impact?
That's such a good question. And I think in order to answer that question, we have to think about who is responsible for us not having a sustainable future right now.
Okay.
Where are the most emissions coming from? If we think about where the most emissions are coming from, then in order to reduce those emissions and to transition to a sustainable future, those are the places, the organizations, the companies, the peoples, the corporations that need to do the most work and need to be the leaders and part of that energy transition and at the forefront of that energy transition. I always have a hard time explaining to people when they ask, what's the number one thing that I can do to help reduce emissions? And the reality is, your own individual footprint, quite frankly, isn't that big of a deal. It doesn't matter as much. It's the collective that matters. So yes, you can recycle. Yes, you can cut plastic straws. Yes, you can reduce the emission. But you alone have a very, very, very small piece to that. What you can do as a collective, whether that's working within your organization or your corporation, whether that's working within your community, whether that's advocating within the spheres of influence that you have an option to, whether it's voting in elections for the governments that will actually enact policies that will help to reduce emissions. To me, that's the biggest impact that you can do. And there is a fallacy, in my view, of offloading the responsibility of emission reduction to the individual and to the consumer, when the reality is the largest emissions are coming from corporations and systems. So when we think about how we need to reduce emissions holistically, it's a systems level approach, it's a supply chain level approach, it's the heavy emission industries, the oil and gas companies, the cement, the steel, the car manufacturing, the fertilizer production, the chemical producers, the airlines. These are the companies that on one hand are essential, absolutely essential to our quality of life. We would not have the benefits that we have today. We wouldn't have the advances in technology, in health, in prosperity, and in relative socioeconomic peace in our countries if it wasn't for these industries. But on the other hand, they are the ones who have the biggest stake in this energy transition as well. So when we talk about who is responsible, it is all of us, but I would say that governments and corporations are more responsible, and individuals are responsible in the context of the spheres of influence in the communities that they can influence. That, and I know that's a bit of a large answer, but I really do see it as a systems transition, not an individual one.
I think it's a fair answer, and I just want to pick one little bit out of it for you to perhaps expand on, and that is, what is the role of government in a
Mhm.
sustainable future?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I always tell people that government will enable the sort of lane or the potentially the technologies, the policies, the box with which we can transition. But ultimately, it is industry that needs to do it. Because I work in the government. If I always, this is a bit of an aside, but I always laugh when I hear conspiracy theorists talking about how governments are watching us and how they're microchipping us and all these sorts of things. Because I go, take these people and stick them into a government for one day, and then they'll realize how bureaucratic, how many approvals, how slow things go, and you're expecting this big scary government to be watching over all of us with the logistics all the time. That's not going to happen. And I think it's the same thing too for the energy transition. We cannot expect the government to be the one to implement the transition, but they are the ones who need to start it, and they need to feed it, they need to nurture it, and it is up to industry to and corporate culture and corporations to execute. And so, what do I mean by that specifically? Well, one of the biggest issues right now, like with the energy transition, is, and the IEA gave a report on this, on the different technologies that we need to reach net zero by 2050, and they found that over 50% of the technologies that we need to reach net zero by 2050 are not yet commercial. 50%. That means half of the technologies that we need are either in the lab, in pilot, in pre-commercial stage, or are under development. When we think about that, the sort of valley of death, the multiple valleys of death that you walk through in technology readiness level, when you go from innovation to impact or from invention to commercialization, it's extremely capital intensive in order to scale up one level on that rung. To go from a prototype to a demonstration is an exponential cost. And to go from a demonstration to a first of a kind pilot plant is an exponential cost. And so the government's role, in my view, is to help de-risk each of those stepwise transitions and each of those development processes to give industry more confidence to then pile on and to actually adopt these technologies. So that's kind of on the initial technology development side of things, and we do that by supporting R&D. We do that through government incentives and tax credits for research and development, through public-private partnerships, in demonstration projects, in supporting breakthrough technology research in academia, and then dispersing that and funding studies and system-level studies in terms of energy infrastructure that needs to be built out. That's how the government can help, and really it's the convening power and the market signal power and the technology de-risking power that governments can really play a hand in. And I would say that's really on the supply side of things. On the demand side of things, that's when we start thinking about policies, right? When we start thinking about carbon taxes and clean fuel standards and emission caps and cap and trade. Those are large, big systems that sometimes have unintended consequences that actually have to work in lockstep with other economies around us, because we are not in isolation. We live in a global connected economy, and that is a little bit harder to do because it requires soft hard influence, geopolitical influence, and lots of negotiation. But it's really, really important as well to give, again, industry more confidence that this tax is here to stay, this incentive is here to stay, that we can actually model this out in our financial modeling into the future. We need We need loan guarantees from government-backed corporations and banks like the Business Development Bank of Canada, so that if you're a corporation and you're going to build a first-of-a-kind carbon capture plant, that you can actually get the loan financing and the private equity and institutional investment with an offtake agreement that you can actually fulfill. If the government can step in and provide those loan guarantees or those agreements, then that gives stability to that transition. So I would say those are the two main areas: the research and development and de-risking new technologies, and then providing security and stability in the policy landscape in order for these new technologies and this transition to actually be implemented. But ultimately, that's really the edges of the transition. The meat, the bones, the execution will needs to be done and at scale by industry and corporations.
Yeah, so in a way, really shortening your answer right the way down, government's an enabler if it's doing its job properly. The worrying thing is if it doesn't understand about a sustainable future, it can be a roadblock to it.
Exactly. And I think, governments are always either an enabler or a deterrent. And
Yeah.
the reason for that, there's good reasons for that, right? And it depends on the systems that we're in. It's really important that we have deterrents to ensure that we have commercial protections in place, that our banking system is robust, that, like for example, in the 2008 financial crisis, it's because of Canada's risk aversion and strong fiscal policy that we averted the worst of the crisis, because we don't allow for subprime mortgages to be lumped in with AAA bonds, right? But America did. So in that case, yes, it's important that we have deterrence. But at the same time, we also have to have enablers that allow for innovation. And I actually think this touches on fundamentally why I think Canada has a scale-up problem. It's because of ultimately, I think Canadian society, government, and industry are extremely conservative and extremely risk averse. When we think about America, they have that entrepreneurial, that innovation, that fail fast mindset. And that's why they're able to move forward and move quickly and are able to scale startups. In Canada, we have incredible, brilliant people. Our educational system is one of the top in the world. People from all over the world come here to learn and to research and to contribute. Some of the biggest breakthroughs that have helped society, penicillin, so many different things were born in Canada. We are the laboratory of the world. The issue is, how do we take that and then turn that into a scalable company or a scalable industry? And I think a big issue of why it doesn't work is, as I said before, we're a primary and a tertiary industry economy, two industries which are extremely risk averse, which have lots of capital expenditures, which are very conservative and don't necessarily purchase or take the risk for these new technologies and these new companies. So we have amazing innovations here, but we don't have the market. And that's why you see these innovations scale elsewhere. And there's a philosophical conversation happening across the country right now where, is that fundamentally a bad thing? If Canada is the laboratory of the world and our innovation scale elsewhere, to me, in a situation like in climate tech, I think that that's a good thing, because regardless if emissions are reduced here or China or India or Africa, CO2 knows no borders. So if our technologies are reducing emissions around the world, that helps Canada too. But that's a different conversation if we're thinking about quantum computing or artificial intelligence or national security or telecommunications. In those situations, Canadian innovations should stay in Canada. And that's what makes it a really difficult conversation when we think about the role of government as an enabler versus as a deterrent, because it's extremely complex and it evolves and changes with the different sectors with which we talk about it.
Thank you.
This is a great conversation, Phil, because John and I have been talking about for many years that you need to be entrepreneurial in managing energy in if you want to be successful. Like if you stay the course and follow the typical pattern, you will not be successful. And so I think it conveyed exactly our culture, that we tend to be conservative and don't try anything new. But you did also mention that we have 50% technology that we could use. And so let's get at it. I think the reason why is most people aren't aware or understand how it can apply. And they have this perception that it's going to be expensive or it's going to be really difficult. And so they don't know. Follow up on this whole thing. And again, reinforcing that our opinion has been that business should be leading this and that government should be the enabler. And you also touched on how that sometimes can be problematic because sometimes there's a change of government that changes things. But
Yeah.
so, from your view, how can a business or organization get involved with government to actually make this, one, better for them, but ultimately to ensure this continues down the right pathway?
Yeah.
Do you have any words of wisdom that you might have or
Yeah. Well,
suggestions based?
I actually think it's already happening, and I think we have to continue on the pathway, right? Like if we think about, let's take the financial sector for example, the push for financial sustainable finance, and for the number of banks that have completely grown their sustainability offices, have hired vice presidents for sustainability, the number of asset managers that are talking about looking at ESG, environmental social governance, as a key tenant into their investment theses. It's exploding, right? And it's interesting because a lot of this was built and spurred on by the insurance sector, right? The insurance sector, they're always thinking about, well, how do we insure assets that are at risk how do we insure a mortgage on a waterfront property when that water is going to be, the shoreline is going to completely wipe out that property in the future and things to come. So leave it to the insurance folks and the accountants to spur the change, but that's really what's happening in the financial sector. It's, you can't manage what you don't measure. And we talked about whether it's fiscal disclosures or climate disclosures, that's really moving the needle in terms of how businesses are thinking about this. So that's the finance side. But when we think about like corporations and business on the production side, the energy side, the heavy industry side, the chemicals, the steel, the manufacturing, the buildings, all of that kind of stuff. One thing we have to recognize is that regardless of political party today, I think everyone recognizes that we need to do something about climate and decarbonization. That was not the truth even 5 years ago, right? The fact that in the last federal election, the Conservative Party acknowledged climate change and actually specifically had a plan for climate change. And, we can have a conversation on, whether a carbon tax is good or not, and what the right way to do this, et cetera, blah, 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 whether it's incentives, et cetera. But, some of the most conservative provincial governments in the country themselves have recognized the need for the transition. In Alberta, they have a CCUS strategy, a hydrogen strategy. This is tangible things. So I think my first piece of advice to businesses are, I don't think you should worry so much about whether the color of the government changes from blue to red or purple or green or whatever. I don't think that's going to matter. I think that the progress and the way that we're trending is we can't go back. We're not going to go back on this. And the discussion has evolved from, is climate real, to obviously climate change is real, to how best can we address this? And now it's all about the right solutions, incentives, and approach to it, and less about whether we should tackle it or not. So be on the right side of that and be a first mover, because you will benefit, is the first thing that I would say. And the second thing I would say is, the way that you continue to build that momentum and to get government support is to organize as an industry. Like you as one business or one corporation, similar to each of us as an individual person, has a limited impact. But if we organize collectively as an individual person, if you vote for policies that move the needle as a corporation, if you advocate as an industry association with government organizations like Natural Resources Canada, like Innovation, Science and Economic Development, like Environment and Climate Change Canada, if you have that dialogue and if you go to these government organizations and say, we are here, we want to do this, we need your help, we don't know what is the right way to do this going forward, we want stability to understand from the policy perspective, can you help us? That is how you signal not only to government, but you create that follow-on effect. And I talked before about how the fossil fuel industry has had decades worth of subsidies because they went to the government and asked for it in order to say, this is critical to our national security, this is critical to our industry, this is critical to our way of life. Well, it's the same thing. The sustainable transformation is going to be the transformation that industry has. The digital transformation we're seeing, we saw that happen in the 90s and the early 2000s, and it's kind of reaping the rewards today. The next big transformation around business and corporations is the sustainable one. And being sure that being vocal to the governments and being vocal to your members of parliament and to all the different departments is so key to show that industry is ready, we want to make, and business is ready, we want to make a change. Help us do it.
So I've been tasked for the next question, and because there's an ongoing understanding what I'm about to ask you, I sometimes don't agree with. But so here's the question. The question is, what incentives are made available or should they be looking at to actually make this transition? So I need to explain what I just stated at the beginning. I think a lot of times it just makes good business sense just to do it. But I think the marketplace isn't informed enough, so they feel they need to have incentives. I know there's exceptions, so just to be clear. But I do worry when you talk about the Canadian thing that I'm only going to do it unless I get government money. That just drives me nuts. But anyhow, come back to the question. The question is, how can or is there incentive money available for clients to actually go into this transition? Can you share with us any thoughts you have in regards to that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you actually with respect to the incentive piece. I mean, we really don't need incentives in order to do this transition. And I think the reason why people think incentives are so necessary is because there's a sticker shock to the upfront capital cost for many of these technologies or transitions. But when you amortize it over the lifetime of that asset and you think about operations cost over the lifetime of something, it ends up being far more economical, far cheaper. And this is across a broad range of things. Electric vehicle. Yes, electric vehicles are expensive today, but take a look at the gas pump price, right? Like how many months is it going to pay off itself and then be a net a benefit to you in the future? Same thing for home retrofits. Yes, it's expensive to get a home retrofit and to get new windows, but your electricity costs and your hydro and heating costs are going to be decreased over the lifetime. So I think the big reason why people think of incentives, it's really it's like a time value of money issue. And when I think about incentives, I like to think of it as less incentivizing people fiscally to do it and more enabling the tools fiscally at the right moment in time for people to do it. And once that starts happening and the economies of scale grow and the costs decrease, we won't need incentives anymore. And I'll give you an example of, electric vehicle incentives in Norway, right? Like a couple of years ago, the number of new cars that were sold for electric vehicles actually were outpaced internal combustion engines. And why? Because Norway was very specific on incentive to allow people to do this, whether that's tax rebates, whether that's creative incentives. Like if you have an electric vehicle, you can get free parking in a downtown parking a street spot. You can have access to a fast lane on the highway, right? These are really, creative incentives that aren't necessarily that have some cost to them, of course, from the bottom line of a municipality or from a provincial budget, from highway tolls or whatever it may be, but are important in helping to spur that initial, consumer confidence, that upfront sticker price cost. So in general, like I agree with you. I think when it comes to like large corporations and large businesses, we shouldn't need incentives. But at the same time, we also have to remember that fossil fuel subsidies have existed for so long, and we don't call them fossil fuel incentives, but in reality that's what a lot of these things are. So what are the incentives that are available to you today? Well, and unfortunately there, and this is a good thing actually, there's so much demand for these incentives that it's actually kind of hard to get some of them. Like for example, there's a $5,000 incentive for home retrofitting that Natural Resources Canada administers. There's electric vehicle incentives for your purchase for an electric vehicle. But demand for electric vehicles are so high that it's hard to get them. The demand for a home retrofit, you need to do an enter guide assessment. The people to do those assessments are so overworked, it's going to take forever for you to get these assessments. So these incentives are well mannered and well placed, but the infrastructure in order to realize them actually needs to catch up. And I think that's one of the things that disincentivizes incentives in the mind of the consumer, is that sure, there are these incentives in place, but I can't get access to them, or they take too long, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think that when you think of an incentive, think of if this incentive wasn't in place, does it still make sense? And oftentimes, the answer over the lifetime of what you're doing is yes, absolutely. And the incentive is just the cherry on top.
Thank you for that.
Fair comment.
All right, another great episode, Phil. Thank you so much for your time. To conclude this episode, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
Well, I think a few. One is, it's a silver buckshot, not a silver bullet. A sustainable future will be a mix of different things, and it's highly regionally dependent. And we need every stakeholder in our society to work towards that. Two is that it is economical and it does make sense, even without incentives, over the lifetime of many of the things that you're doing as a business to be part of this energy transition today and now. And three is that government is there to enable, it's there to de-risk, it's there to help provide the swim lane, but ultimately it is up to industry to implement and business to execute and to swim fast. So I would say those are the main takeaways from the podcast.
Thank you for that, Phil. Dave, John, any final comments?
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment. Phil, one of the things that we researched is that a lot of, specifically in North America, that there's not the expertise in the energy side to actually advance the marketplace. But truthfully, with your comments and what you've discussed today, that certainly you haven't shown that. Like, you have the expertise and knowledge, and so I'm really pleased in hearing and what you're discussing, because that's the type of thought process we need to have in government to make things happen. So I'm really grateful for you to be describing and talking to us today, because I think that bodes well, I think, for our marketplace. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting talking to you, and I do like yours. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think we need another one that says something about inactivity is not an option.
Yep.
I'm not sure I've got that quite right. I want to work on that one, but I think at the moment, and I think that almost ties into that under part of, we're working on what the best solution is. I think there's a subset of that is, it's too complicated, or we'll wait until government tells we've got to do it. We'll sit back and not do anything. And I think if you want to be a surviving, sustainable business in the future, if you haven't started, you're already a bit late. So, catch up.
Time to get on it.
Yeah.
Yep,
Exactly.
the time is now. All right, Dave, John, Phil, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
360 Energy is a North American leader in energy and carbon reduction. Recently, we have launched the 360 Carbon Excellence Program, designed to make corporate climate change actions more effective and successful. For more information, check the link in our podcast description. That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.